welcome to this special edition of Extension Engaged. I'm your host, Scott Fedale. On today's program, we have a chance to talk with a nationally known author, Allan Johnson, who's been researching, speaking, and writing about issues of privilege, oppression, and social inequity since receiving his PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan in 1972. Since then, he's authored a number of books, including The Gender Knot, Unraveling Our Patriarchal Legacy, The Forest and the Trees, Sociology as Life, Practice, and Promise, and the Blackwell Dictionary of Sociology, and of course the one we'll be talking about today, Privilege, Power, and Difference. Before I begin my conversation with Dr. Johnson, let me give you the information that you'll need to be able to send us your questions for our question and answer period later in the program. Now, for today's program, we have two toll-free numbers that you can all use to ask questions on today's program if you're located off campus. Those numbers are for toll-free phone 1-800-390-7551, and the fax number is 803-5998. We also have an email address you can use to email us your questions, and that is broadcast@wsu.edu. Now, there's going to be time at the end of the program to ask questions live on the air. But if you want to phone in then and go live, you're certainly welcome to. But also, if you have a question at any time during the program, you can fax, phone, or email it to us, and they'll get it down to me here on the set, and I'll try to work it into our question and answer period. Now, for those of you here in the audience in Pullman live, if you have a question, I'd ask that you raise your hand so that our cameraman can track you down, and then I'll recognize you, and then I'll ask you to just stand, ask your question, identify yourself, and ask your question. Now, let's begin our program with our distinguished guest today, lecturer and author, Dr. Allan Johnson. Allan, first of all, welcome to the program. Welcome to Pullman.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you taking the time to do this broadcast so that, as I mentioned, the conversation and your thoughts are not only available here in Pullman, but to a lot of WSU faculty and staff who are located in some 50-plus locations around the state of Washington, so we do appreciate it. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're here today to talk about some of the ideas expressed in your latest book, Privilege, Power, and Difference, which focuses on issues of how power in our society is tied to what you describe as an inherent system of privilege and class, which is then tied to racial, gender, and sexual preference issues. So let me begin with sort of an opening question. Your first chapter has a title, Rodney King's Question. Now, for those of us who don't remember the Rodney King incident, the question was, can't we all just get along? And in this chapter, you say, clearly, we aren't getting along with each other. Now, why do you say that?
Well, it depends on who you ask, I think. If you ask white people, for example, in the United States, whether we're getting along in terms of race, most white people will say, yes, we are, that there are no problems there. But if you listen to people of color, you get a very different story. We are still, for example, a very heavily segregated society. If we wanted to have neighborhoods that were racially integrated in the United States, something like 3/4 of every person would have to move. That's how segregated we are. In other words, that's the degree to which we will not live with one another. And the reason for racial segregation, the research shows quite clearly, continues to be that white people do not want to live in integrated neighborhoods. So while they may not have a consciousness of that, while white people may not have a consciousness of that they will report, the fact is that we are not living with one another. The amount of misery that is reported by people of color in their everyday lives, misery that white people generally have no consciousness of at all, is horrendous, and you only need to read the accounts, for example, of Ellis Cose's book, The Rage of a Privileged Class, where he's talking about African Americans who have done everything that white people told them they should do to succeed, and they find that it's not enough, that they cannot change the color of their skin, and it affects their lives every day. So I think there are all kinds of indicators around race that we are not getting along, not to mention the increasing gap in income and wealth in the United States by race, and all that goes along with that, all the indicators of quality of life, of health care and so on, the way the criminal justice system treats people differently depending on their race. The amount of resources that is devoted to controlling the population of color in this country, beginning with police departments. And again, for many white people, all of this is beneath the surface of their attention. They don't see this as going on. But of course, if you're a person of color, you see it all the time. I could make the same response to your question in terms of gender. There is an epidemic of violence, men's violence against women in this society, violence, sexual harassment, stalking, and it is an epidemic that's very well documented. and has been going on for a very long time. The failure rate of marriages in this society is still very high. So I think, again, you can go through a whole litany of patterns that indicate that, no, we're not getting along very well at all.
Now, your answer to that question sort of sets the stage for the next one. Your second chapter is titled very directly, "We're in Trouble." And I guess the first question is, who is the we in this phrase? And secondly, what is the trouble you're talking about? I think you've talked about some of it.
Yeah, I think I have talked about some of the trouble. The we, though, I think it's an important question because everybody is included in the we. There's a tendency to define problems of privilege and oppression as being only problems for those who are in the subjugated group. So race becomes defined as an issue for people of color. And I think that's a mistake. White people pay a price for white privilege. Unfortunately, it's not a high enough price to get them to try to give up white privilege, but there's a cost that gets exacted. One way that I see that is that in most groups of white people, excuse me, if you bring up the subject of white privilege, if you just say that phrase, defensiveness and denial are never very far from the surface, which means that white people are having to manage on some level a certain amount of guilt. There's an awareness there that things are not right around race, because it takes very little to bring out that defensive reaction. I'm not racist, you're not talking about me. And so there's a methinks thou dost protest too much that's very close to the surface. And it takes a lot of energy to manage that. We're living in a society in which increasingly white people, I think, are feeling frightened of people of color and are going to all kinds of lengths to protect themselves from that perceived threat. So I think there's a way that in terms of race that we are all in this trouble. Abraham Lincoln once expressed the idea that, you know, if this society gets destroyed, it's not going to be because of some external enemy coming in and destroying us. He said, we're going to do this to ourselves. And I think that that was true then in terms of the legacy of slavery that he was dealing with, and I think it's still true in terms of race, it's true in terms of gender, it's true in terms of class.
So the trouble that we're in is all about, as you said, privilege and power, the existence of privilege and I guess a lopsided distribution of power, which you described. You talked about male privilege. How about defining, in the way you're talking about it, the term privilege?
Yeah, it's a buzzword for a lot of people, and I think it's very much misunderstood in how it's used. I use the definition that was first introduced by Peggy McIntosh in her wonderful article, which is called Unpacking the Knapsack of White Privilege. And she describes privilege as being simply an unearned advantage, or it might be thought of as whenever you have something of value in a society, and people's access to it is determined solely by their membership in a particular group. So for me, I have access to male privilege simply because people perceive me as being male, and the privilege is attached to that group. That's all that it takes. So
you didn't earn it.
I didn't do anything to earn my male privilege, my white privilege, my heterosexual privilege, nothing. I just happened to be born in a particular society that attaches privilege to those categories. So the advantage can take all kinds of forms. The day I was born, I had a better chance of earning a PhD than someone of a different race or gender than I. I had a better chance of earning a good income. Today, I mean, last night after I got dropped off at the hotel, I went back outside and took a little walkabout for myself. I never thought for a second about my personal safety. I've never met a woman who does not, in some way, even if it's just for a second, have to calculate, is this a smart thing for me to do, to go walking by myself at night? So for women in this society, something as simple as taking a walk by themselves without having to think about their safety becomes an issue of privilege because I have access to it in a way that no woman has access to it. So in general, when you have something of value that is getting distributed arbitrarily according to these categories that people happen to belong to, then it becomes privilege.
Now, in the same chapter, you also talk about the importance of us being able to talk about the problem, and you talk about what you describe as reclaiming the words needed to talk about the problem. Explain what you mean by the phrase reclaiming the words.
Yeah. We have a phobia about talking about issues of privilege in this society. It's almost a taboo. As I was talking about last night in my presentation on violence, it's not allowed to couple the word male with the word violence, even though males account for most of the violence in this society. We can talk about violence against women, but we're not supposed to talk about men's violence against women, because that makes men feel uncomfortable, and you're not allowed to do that in a patriarchal society. So what we do is, I think we live in a kind of a sea of denial of what we're up against. And Language, of course, is the only thing we human beings have to name reality. So if we're not allowed to use certain words, then we're also not allowed to name the reality those words point to. So a word like patriarchy, which I use everywhere I go when I do speaking, is I use the word patriarchy because patriarchy is a word that points to something real. It points to a system of male privilege. And if we don't have that word, it becomes very difficult to literally see the system of male privilege. Words like racism are very important to reclaim because the word racism has been turned into a kind of individual pejorative. It's an insult. So if you say to a white person, what you've just done is racist, they will immediately think you've said something about their characters rather than something about the consequence of what they've just done. So as an example of this, my work has been built in part on the work of a sociologist at Berkeley named David Wellman, who argues that we take a word like racism, and we need to have that word point not to some individual attitude or antipathy towards people based on race. We need to use that word in a much broader sense that points to anything that is done or not done that has the consequence of promoting white privilege. So a well-intentioned person can do something without any awareness that the consequence of what they're doing is actually going to support white privilege. And Wellman says that makes the action a racist action. I don't know anything about the person's character. And he says, frankly, I don't want to know. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what do we do and what are the consequences of what we do in terms of white privilege or male privilege or any other form of privilege.
So you're am I hearing this, that you're expanding the definition of the word like race as an example? It could be used to describe an action which is really dealing with gender problems.
Sure.
But I think the connotation we use it with is pretty much attached to race all the time.
Well, racism is. I mean,
yeah.
I could make the same argument about sexism.
Right.
But what happens in general is when you have a language that gets developed, the word feminist is another very good example. When you have a language that develops to be used in social criticism, to name things that are problematic, invariably what happens is that language gets trashed. It gets turned into pejoratives. So feminist has now become an insult in this society, when in fact the word feminism points to a framework for thinking and observing the world that is the only hope we've got to really see accurately what patriarchy and male privilege are about. So when those words get demonized, it's a very powerful thing that gets in the way of change. And a lot of my work has to do with taking those words back and undemonizing them so that we can use them.
How do we do that?
Well, one way you undemonize them is that I'll tell you how I do that. Last night I gave a presentation here about gender and patriarchy. And I never used the word feminist in my presentation. I also never used the word radical. If someone had asked me, so what's the foundation, the theoretical foundation for what you were saying last night, I would say, oh, it's radical feminism. That's what it is. Most people do not think of radical feminism in those terms because they have the trashed version of radical feminism. It's a bunch of women running around who hate men. Okay? But in fact, what radical feminism, I would argue, is grounded in is the simple premise that patriarchy is real. It exists, and it's problematic. That's all. That's what radical feminism is really about, is that patriarchy is real. So I give a presentation that really is presenting radical feminism without actually saying that's what I'm doing. And very often what will happen is someone will ask something about that, and I'll say, oh, I've just been talking to you about radical feminism, and they're sort of startled by that. And what I'm doing in that moment is taking those words, the word radical, which is a very important word about getting to the roots of things, and the word feminism, which has been trashed, and bringing them back, recasting them. And when people will hear my presentations on patriarchy, typically they go, oh yeah, you're describing the world I live in. I recognize that world. Well, I'm also describing the world that radical feminism describes. That's what it's all about. So I bring the words back in by first bringing in the world as they experience it, and then saying, oh, well, that's what these words are here to point to.
And in essence, you're really trying to redefine or change it back. Change it back to what it's, yeah. Okay, good.
I think so.
In this, in the same chapter, you also talk about a paradox that you title being privileged and underprivileged at the same time. Mm-hmm. An interesting concept. Explain, please.
Or unprivileged, I think I would say.
Yeah.
Systems of privilege are complicated in that they're not unidimensional. So no one ever looks at me and simply sees a man, for example, or a white person. They will see me as a man of a certain race, a certain age, a certain class, a certain presumed sexual orientation. There's a whole range of things that will come in there at once, never just one of them. So that means that I have the potential to belong to a privileged category. I might be white, but I also might be working class, or I might be of color, or gay, or lesbian, so that there can be inconsistencies. And I run into this as a problem most often, I think, with working class white males, because their class position makes them feel anything but having access to privilege. And so if you want to talk about them having access to race privilege or male privilege, they get very upset about that, because as far as they're concerned, they're struggling for everything they get every single day. So it makes it difficult then for them to see the existence of their privilege because it's inconsistent for them. Similar things happen with women. White women, for example, very often, and the whole history of the women's movement has included a lot of conflict around race, that white women of a certain class very often will be very conscious of their oppression as women, but may be very unconscious of their privilege as whites. And so this becomes a source of disconnect, of conflict within the movement itself. And this is why I think it's very important, and I guess we will get to this, but it's very important to see privilege as not something that's an individual characteristic, but privilege rather is a kind of potential that's embedded in social systems. So when I say when I was born with a greater potential for certain kinds of things, being able to get them. But other things could interfere with my realizing that potential if I had been born, depending on the race that I was born into, the class I was born into. But the potential still exists. The advantage still exists because it's part of the social system. It's not me. It's not like the color of my eyes. It's in the social system itself. And that's a way in which I found, working in community colleges, this comes up a lot because a lot of the students are working class. And this comes up a lot. And very often they're able to start to disentangle those things, to see that their experience as members of the working class doesn't necessarily tell them something accurate about the existence of white privilege in the society or the existence of male privilege. They just can't get at it to the same degree that a white male in the upper middle class can get at it.
Okay. And in essence, you started to answer a question which formed in my mind as I was hearing you say that. So someone who has, let's say, two categories of privilege because they're white and male, but because they're working class or they might be homosexual, as opposed to someone who, maybe myself, who is white, male, or you, does that mean then, because they have they're living a piece of the unprivileged part of things, that they understand this problem any better than you or I?
No, I don't think it necessarily means that, but very often that can be a doorway that they can go through. Because they can have an experience of being excluded, for example, of being devalued, of always having to prove themselves, of always feeling on the line based on that one characteristic. A lot of the best writing that men have done about patriarchy has been done by gay men. And I think part of that is because they have had that experience of being outsiders. And when you're an outsider, you get a point of view that it's harder to have when you're on the inside. So I think that outsider status has given them a point of view on male privilege that heterosexual men are less likely to have. So I think, yes, it can be a way of getting them to empathize, a way of giving them a point of view that can be much harder for someone like me, who has always had access to virtually every major form of privilege. It becomes harder to find a way to step back and get a perspective on it.
Okay. You begin your next chapter with the following statement: to do something about the trouble around difference. We have to talk about it, but most of the time we don't because it feels so risky. And you say one of the paths to reducing risk is to change how people think about things and who they are in relation to them. Now, I believe you're talking about the difference between thinking of everything as revolving around individuals versus the view that we're all part of the larger social system. Talk a little about this concept, because I find it rather fascinating.
Well, what you're referring to is what I call the individualistic model of the world. Which means that everything that happens, everything that we do or don't do, comes down to a question of our characters, and that's all that it's about. So that the explanation of violence, for example, is that, well, there are these violent people in the world, and they do the violence because that's who they are. That's what the individualistic model tells us. And I use the example of Monopoly, the game of Monopoly, and how I don't play the game of Monopoly anymore, and point out the fact that when I don't play Monopoly, I don't behave in that greedy, ruthless way, which explains why I stopped playing Monopoly. So what is it? I either have a split personality that kicks in when I'm playing Monopoly or not, or it's because I'm playing Monopoly. That's why I behave that way. So the model that I'm arguing for is that, it's not saying that individuals are unimportant and the really important thing is social systems. What it's saying is that there's a dynamic relationship between social systems and us. We're participating in something. And to understand what we do as participants, and therefore to understand the consequences that come out of all of that, we have to understand not one thing but two. We have to understand what game we're playing, if you will. What's the system? How does it set us up to follow certain paths? And then how do we as individuals actually do it? What choices do we make, consciously and unconsciously, through which we then participate in that system? So if a man goes out and sexually assaults a woman, in the individualistic model, the tendency is to explain his behavior solely in relation to his personality, his motivations in the moment, his childhood, all that stuff. That becomes the basis for explaining his behavior. This model says, no, he's participating in something. That's like explaining somebody's ruthless behavior while they're playing Monopoly by saying, well, look, they're just a ruthless, greedy person, and say, but they're playing Monopoly. So my question becomes, what are we playing when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexual orientation, that sets people up to make choices that result in these kinds of patterns, violence, of inequality, of injustice, segregation, whatever it might be. So that we need to expand our notion of what we're in and who we are in relation to that.
Okay. In this discussion, and you alluded to it in your answer, you talk about the fact that part of what this is all about is what paths we choose to follow within this system. And you use the term paths of least resistance. How does this relate to the concept?
Well, as at any given moment, there are certain alternatives that appear to us as being possible. So right now, for example, I have to keep talking to you. That's the path of least resistance for me. If I stop talking to you for not very long, or if you stop talking, we would have a little crisis in this little system that we're participating in, right? So that's the path of least resistance. I might not want to do that, but I will weigh that against the alternatives. And the alternatives, in this case, will have more resistance attached to them than the path of least resistance. So we tend most of the time, and I think unconsciously for the most part, we tend to gravitate towards what in that situation is defined as the path of least resistance. So for example, a group of white people are having some kind of gathering and someone tells a racist joke. The path of least resistance in that moment for a white person who objects to that joke is to be silent. It may not be easy. They might be full of turmoil in that moment, but they might think that, well, if I say something, if I say, I object to this, I think it's racist, I think it's making all kinds of problems, they may lose their friends may not want to be with them anymore, all kinds of bad things may happen.
So that was that piece of being risky that you talked about earlier.
That's the risky part,
yeah.
Right. And in all kinds of situations, the example I use is elevators. We get in and turn, and everybody says, well, you turn around. And I say, why do you turn around? And we do. And if you don't turn around, you find out why you turn around. Because people, they look at you funny, they treat you funny, and we want to fit in. We don't want to be treated like we're odd or a problem. So the path of least resistance helps explain why our tendency is to participate in systems in the way that the systems are laid out for us to participate, which is what then reproduces the systems and produces all of the consequences, including racism and sexism and all that goes with it. But this is also our potential for hope, because when we become aware of what we're participating in and the paths of least resistance that sets down for us, we can start making different choices. We can step off the path of least resistance. We can, if you will, we can face the rear of the elevator. We can object to the racist joke. We can start asking questions about, why is it that my department is all white? Why is it that there are so few women chairs of departments or tenured and so on? We can start asking openly questions that will make people uncomfortable, that may get us into trouble, but that have the potential for altering not simply the way other people think, but of altering the way systems actually happen, which is far more powerful than just changing someone's mind.
You have a section in this chapter that's titled, What It Means to Be Involved in Privilege and Oppression. And here you talk again about how individuals and systems are connected to each other and how it relates to privilege and oppression. And you make a statement that I'd like you to explain that says, good people with good intentions make systems happen that produce all kinds of injustice and suffering for people in culturally devalued and excluded groups. Quite a strong statement. Mm-hmm. If this is true, how do we prevent this from happening? You got good people, good intentions, bad results.
Yeah, good people have to wake up, basically. We have to become conscious of what it is that we're participating in, how it sets us up to reproduce systems of privilege, which also means to reproduce systems of oppression. I'll give you an example. The whole process of hiring people, whether it's in corporations or universities, when you hire people, you have certain standards in mind. What will be what's a successful candidate? What's a superior candidate? And those standards are invariably going to be identified with the dominant group. They will be male-identified standards. They will be white-identified standards. They will be heterosexual-identified standards. They will be upper-middle-class identified standards. And typically, though, we don't think of them as that. So the recruiting committee for an academic department, for example, doesn't sit there and say, well, okay, now let's see, what are the white standards, the white-identified standards that we've got here, and the male-identified standards? No, they don't see them as that. They see them as the standards. That's what it means for a society to be male-identified and white-identified. It's not, we don't think of them as that. We think of them, that's what a good person is. That's what a smart person is. That's what a creative person is. That's what they look like. That's what they sound like. So that when people then hire people, and the higher you go up in organizations, the more subjective the decisions become. Okay? People then evaluate candidates. They perceive them. They interpret their behavior and their credentials. And they're going to tend to select people who fit the male, white, heterosexual, upper middle class identified criteria, thinking that what they are selecting for is quality in some objective, unbiased way, when they may not necessarily be doing that at all. So the tendency then, and these can be people who are well-intentioned, who haven't a mean bone in their bodies, who never go around thinking a nasty thought about anyone based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or anything else, and yet they are implementing what they, by living in this kind of society, what they perceive as being objective, neutral standards of excellence. And in doing that, they are reproducing institutions that are white-dominated, male-dominated, and so on. And if you look around at most institutions of higher learning in the United States, that's exactly what you see.
So basically, we're hiring in our own image, if I could.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. In a male-identified, white-identified. And women, of course, can participate. White women, people of color can participate in that process. And as long as they identify with the dominant group, they can invoke those very same standards and think that, yes, they're just defending excellence. When in fact what they are doing, and there may be truth in that, of course, but they are also defending the continuation of a white-dominated, male-dominated, et cetera, world.
Patterns of dominance. You talk about patterns of dominance and the paths of least resistance and that govern them and that they show up in every system of privilege. You go on to say that mainstream culture makes it pretty clear who's in power, and you give some examples using film, television. Talk a little about what you mean here.
If you were a visitor from another planet, and you well, actually, let's say the world has been destroyed and some party comes from another planet, see what happened. They find film archives. That's the only thing that's left of us in our vaults. And they were to start watching all these videos, these films, television shows, news reports, and so on. And we're try to piece together some sense of what kind of society was this. You would get the sense that the only people who ever did anything of importance were white heterosexual males. That everyone else is in some kind of support role, or they are simply the ones who create the problems that the white heterosexual males come in and solve. Go to a movie, just open the movie section of any newspaper and say, who are these stories about? And you have to really look hard to find a story that's being told in films that's about someone who happens to be a woman, or happens to be anything other than heterosexual, or happens to be anything other than white. It's very hard to find them. They're just not there. And that, actors who are of color complain all the time that they can't find a role that has got any weight to it at all. Women actors, especially as they get older, the same thing happens to them. There are no roles out there for them. So the world as it's presented through film and television, literature for the most part, the world as it's presented to us as we grow up in it is a world that seems to be peopled largely by white heterosexual males who do everything that's important. Actually, they're also the ones who create the biggest problems, but then they're the ones who come in and heroically solve those problems. But it's still all about them either way. So they're the arch enemies, but they're also the they're the heroes who defeat those enemies. So the world basically is all about them.
And I would assume that if we would talk about looking behind the scenes to see so who's making those decisions about putting those actors, we'll find that again the male privilege is operating here.
But even when women, say white women, are making those decisions, if they're producing television shows or directing films and so on, they are still doing that within an institution, within an organization that is white, male, heterosexual, dominated, identified, and so on. And if they're going to become producers, if they're going to become directors, they've got to show their allegiance to that basic structure, or they're not going to have work. So we would expect them to basically turn out the same things that men would turn out in the same positions.
You've been talking a lot about privilege, about male privilege. You classify what you call 4 characteristics of systems of male privilege. Talk a little about these characteristics.
Well, I've mentioned some of them already.
Right.
Very briefly, because it can take a long time to explain these, but all systems of privilege have 4 basic characteristics. They are dominated by a particular group, and that's fairly self-explanatory. So we're living in a male-dominated, white-dominated, heterosexual-dominated society. They are organized around an obsession with control, which is necessary to maintain dominance, but also, especially in the case of gender, is a key aspect of defining the dominant group. We're defined by our supposed capacity to always be in control. They are identified with the dominant group, which simply means that the dominant group is taken for the standard for human beings in general. So the way men see things is taken to be the way things are. Not the male point of view, but it's just taken to be the way things are. And that male identification leads to all kinds of assumptions about men being superior, what we do being better than anything that women do, and so on. And then the last one is male-centeredness, which I was touching on just before, which is the path of least resistance is for us to place men and boys at the center, make that the focus of our attention, the front page of the newspapers, the films, the lead stories in the news, and so on.
You have a phrase in there which I couldn't pass up asking you about. Men are the cultural standard for humanity, women are just women. This is talking about what you just explained, I assume. Yeah. Yeah,
we are the human beings. We are the standard for the human being. So I hear this all the time in news stories, for example, where let's see if I can come up with an actual example. But someone will say, well, you know, people in the United States just hate to lose. Patton made his famous speech about, Americans love a winner, we love a good war, we hate to lose a war, we'll never lose a war. Who's the we he's talking about? Is he talking about his mother?
Yeah.
His grandmother? I doubt it.
Yeah.
I doubt it. He's talking about men. But so it's when that particular dominant group becomes the we in all kinds of senses. I do this. I mean, it is so easy to slip into this. And more now, I'm glad to hear it. People I work with are saying, can you tell me right now who you mean by we? And so what I'm most guilty of that is I'll say we, and what I mean is the United States, not the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's on a larger level, the system of privilege. And so I'm living in a world in which our universe is centered on us. We think the world begins and ends with us. So this sense of who's the we here? And the we is the standard. The we is the standard. And typically in this society, when you hear people characterizing people in this society in general, what they're saying, they're really referring to males, or they're referring to white males, they're referring to heterosexual white males of a certain class. The other example that I come across the most, because I was born in 1946, so I was on the leading edge of the baby boom generation, and there's all this talk about what boomers are like. They want to drive SUVs and their consumption patterns and everything, and I was thinking, who are we talking about? Are we talking about people of color in this country? Are we talking about women in this country? Are we talking about people in the working and lower classes in this country? And the working and lower class makes up about 50% of everybody in this country? Who are we talking about? That's an example of how these general statements, the standard, gets reduced down to the dominant groups, the groups with access to privilege. But when we talk about it as if we're talking about everybody. That's the power of this identification process that you're talking about here.
Allan, we've spent most of the discussion so far talking about the characteristics of the problem and trying to explain how it operates and how it's defined. In Chapter 9, which is titled Getting Off the Hook, you talk about the various ways that those of privilege try to distance themselves from the problems associated with power and privilege. You identify a laundry list of common strategies, things like deny and minimize, blame the victim, call it something else, it's better this way, it doesn't count if you don't mean it, I'm one of the good ones. How about just picking a few of those, and let's talk about how these operate in terms of enabling us to distance ourselves from the problems. And the us here is you and I.
The us is you and I. Sure. Blaming the victim, this is common across all forms of privilege. People in the working and lower classes are routinely blamed for the fact that they are in the working and lower classes, as if it's their fault. They don't work hard enough, they're lazy, they lack talent, ability, whatever it is. They are basically blamed for that. Instead of blaming an economic system that enables a tiny percentage of the population to control almost all the wealth and income, which means that the vast bulk of the population then has to compete over what's left, which means invariably some people are going to be at the bottom of that competition, but blaming the victim says they have only themselves to blame for that, not the overall structure that makes it inevitable that somebody's going to be on the bottom. Women are routinely blamed for the violence that men do to them. They're blamed for the sexual violence that men do to them. They're blamed for the battering that men do to them. All the time this happens. So it's routine for the victim to be blamed. Zero Mostel, the comedian, I remember he made that joke about Pearl Harbor and the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. And from the blame the victim perspective, you would say, so what was Pearl Harbor doing out there anyway? That's blaming the victim. Oh, what else?
It doesn't count if you don't mean it.
Yes, it doesn't count if you don't mean it. It goes right back to the individualistic model, because what it's saying is that the only thing that's important here are my intentions, not the consequences of my actions, but my intentions. So if I can establish my purity and my innocence, then that's the end of the conversation. We don't need to look at the racist or sexist or homophobic consequences of what I've done or not done, because the issue really is about me. So if I didn't consciously intend to say what I said, if I didn't think before the words came out of my mouth, this is what I'm going to say, then I can disavow any responsibility for saying it, as if someone else said it. I mean, this happens all the time. You know, politicians will say outrageous things, and they'll say, well, I misspoke, and I'm never quite sure what that means, or I didn't mean to say that, and I don't know what to make of that. So what, you didn't mean to say that? You did it. You know, I didn't mean to shoot you. Well, that's great, but you shot me. And we need to deal with the fact that you are the one who shot me. But this kind of language, this, that I didn't mean to do it, is simply a way of saying I'm not accountable for what I do. And this is a key aspect of privilege. Members of privileged groups are never supposed to be held to account by members of subordinate groups. So if they say I didn't mean it, or I was only joking, or you're too sensitive, going back to blaming the victim, that is a way of stepping aside and saying I'm not accountable to you. Now, the other one that's related to that, that's one of my favorites, is the I'm sick and tired of this, which comes up a lot. I had a colleague once who said, complained one day, she said, I'm sick and tired of always hearing about race. And I said to her, when was the last time you heard about race? She's white. And she thought a little bit. I don't know, I hear about it all the time. And I pressed her gently. What's all the time? Well, it turned out all the time was not very often at all. So rarely, actually, that she really couldn't remember. But when you're in a privileged group, the default is that you're never supposed to be inconvenienced by having to look at your own privilege. The default is 0. So there's a very low tolerance level. So if white people or men are compelled by circumstances to pay attention to their privilege and its consequences for even a small amount of time, they can experience this as an imposition. And so the sense of outrage, the sense of I'm sick and tired of this, you're always pushing this in my face, shoving it down my throat, that anger, which stops the conversation, becomes a form of denial, a way of pushing this away, of making it go away, even though the thing that's being made to go away is tiny. And there are all kinds of mechanisms through which this happens.
Okay, we've done a rather complete job of painting the problem and the reasons for the problem. How do you answer the question of what can we do about the problem of privilege? And I guess the obvious, everybody looks for the simple solution. Are there some simple steps that we can all take that really will matter, that will help?
I think the default in this society is to do nothing. It is to be silent and to do nothing. So compared to that, doing something is of tremendous significance. If 1 out of every 10 people in the United States did something every day, no matter how small, something open that other people could see, that focused in some way on issues of privilege, it would be revolutionary. I liken it to the advice that people get about exercise. If you want to make a quantum leap in your health and your longevity, you don't go from 0 to being a triathlete. The most significant difference is between doing nothing and doing something in terms of actual health gains. And I think in terms of social change, the same is true. The most important thing is that we do something, because the fact is that for the vast majority of people, the default is to do absolutely nothing. And I think that begins with simply being aware of what we're in. That's the hardest thing for most people, is to become aware of what we're participating in, how we as individuals are participating in it, what's our position in relation to it, and then to maintain that awareness. A lot of times people will come to one of my presentations and they get stirred up and now I understand this, I see this, and I don't know what they see the next day or a week later. It may be just gone. It may have been one of those things that was really interesting and then it disappears. And if you want to become part of the solution to these issues, the challenge is to make this part of a life practice. It's something we need to pay attention to every day. And the only way I know of, when people who have religious practices, for example, the way they keep that in front of them every day is that they create a structure. They have a ritual, for example. They have to create some kind of structure that helps them to attend to this every single day. And I think with these kinds of issues, it takes the same kind of discipline, so that awareness is ongoing, so that we can be aware of what's happening in the moment. Looking around a room as a white person and seeing no people of color, and seeing no people of color. What's going on here? Why are there no people of color in the room? Why are there no women in the room? Why is it there are a lot of women in the room and men are doing all the talking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That kind of awareness is something that has to be actively maintained. We don't just fall into it. We can't be passive about it. So I think in many ways that's the greatest challenge especially for members of dominant groups, for whom the luxury of obliviousness is seductive. The greatest challenge is to develop and maintain that ongoing consciousness so that we are aware of what's happening and what it has to do with us.
One of the suggestions you made was one I wanted to ask you about. It says, dare to make people uncomfortable, beginning with yourself. That's an interesting approach for a lot of people, because as you said, it's easy to come to your lecture, say, yeah, I agree with all that, but that's not me.
Right.
Yeah, and then walk away.
Yes.
How do you go about making yourself uncomfortable on a regular basis?
Part of it is the paying attention, because then I notice things. There's the whole phenomenon of white people not being able to distinguish among different people of color. They all look alike to us. And I can talk about that as a presenter, and here's a manifestation of white privilege and the mindset that it induces in white people. I have my piece of that. I've had some very embarrassing experiences where I have just not retained, because of the quality of my attention to people of color is different than my quality of attention to white people, because I'm white and I'm living in a racist society. And so I've had to come up against, of course, I'm a human being like everybody else. I follow the path of least resistance often too. And being open to that, to seeing that, and not taking it personally in that sense. In other words, not saying, oh, this is all about me now I've got to somehow find a way to make myself pure and innocent again, but of saying, no, fact is, there it is. There it is again. And being willing to pay attention to that, I think is a very important thing for us to be able to do. Being able to look at it and learn from it. So the issue is not whether I'm racist or not. Of course I am. I listened to Amos and Andy when I was 5 years old on the radio. I learned to imitate their voices because that was what was considered funny, and my family roared when I did that. So I've got Amos and Andy's voices in my head, and they will be in my head for the rest of my life. And does that color in some way my experience of people of color? Does it have some effect on that? Of course it does. And I would be fooling myself. I would be lying to myself if I said, of course I'm somehow beyond that. Touches everybody else, but not Allan Johnson. Of course it touches me. And I have to be willing to look at that. I have to be willing to be aware of that, moment to moment.
So if I do that, if we do that, I guess the final question you ask in your book is one I know a lot of us ask. So what's in it for me if I do all this? Try to make a difference.
Well, I think the answer to what's in it for me is on multiple levels. On the largest level, I think systems of privilege are killing us. I think they're killing us individually. I think they're killing us spiritually. I think they're killing us physically. I think we are destroying the earth as a habitat, and that patriarchy has an enormous amount to do with that, how we think about the earth, how we think about other forms of life. We are, as my mother would say, we are fouling our own nest. And I think that's really serious. The human species has never been as well positioned as we are now to destroy ourselves. We have just finished the most catastrophic century in the history of our species. The reasonable estimate is that 120 million people were killed in the first 75 years of the 20th century as a result of war. 120 million people. And most of them were not killed by what are now identified as weapons of mass destruction. They were killed by what I consider to be real weapons of mass destruction: machine guns, artillery, bombs from airplanes. 120 million people. So I think we're in great danger. So first of all, anyone who has any regard for the future of this species, for the future of this planet, for a species of life other than our own, has a vested interest in dealing with issues of privilege, because they are literally leading us on the way to, actively, to our own destruction, and the destruction of things much larger than us. On a more immediate level, I think the choice, especially for people who have access to privilege, for white people, for men in particular, I think the choice about following the paths of least resistance and not is a choice between living as full human beings and not. And also as full moral human beings and not. To live as a white person in this society and to actively resist making yourself part of the solution, I think, is to live in a morally indefensible position. And that costs us something to do that, because I think we all really value our sense of ourselves as good, decent, moral human beings. And if we compromise by allowing oppression to exist and doing nothing about it, if only being part of the problem, then I think we compromise ourselves as moral human beings. The price that men pay for participating in patriarchy, the price to their emotional lives, to their spiritual lives, to their connections to other human beings, to their parents, to their partners, to their children, is huge. The amount of violence and cruelty that men do to other men, from pile-ups in football games to warfare to politics to academic department meetings, the amount of cruelty and violence that men inflict on other men, and the fear that they then learn to live with as a result, takes a tremendous toll on people's lives. So I would say that to any men, for example, who are wondering whether or not to make themselves part of the solution around issues of male privilege and patriarchy, I think the real question is, do you want to live your life as a human being? Or do you want to live your life as some stripped-down version of a human being, for whom, a group of people for whom suicide rates skyrocket as they get older? And homicide rates are one of the major causes of death when they're young. Is that what you want? Is that what you want for yourself? Is that what you want for your daughters, for your sons? And I think that when men really think about that, if they can get themselves to the place where they accept the reality of what I'm describing to you, I think their answer will tend to be no, that's not what I want.
Well, you and I could go on talking about your book for a long time, but I want to take some time for questions from our audience watching here in Pullman as well as across the state. And let me remind you that those of you watching by satellite or video stream of the toll-free numbers. There's the telephone number, the fax number. If you can call in and ask to go live on the air, or you can call and ask our operator to write down your question. And our email address also, we're still taking email, is broadcast@wsu.edu. And again, for those of you here in Pullman, and I'm going to start with you here in Pullman for the first question, please raise your hand. I'll recognize you and ask you to stand up, state your name, and then your question. So starting here in Pullman, do we have a first question here in the audience in Pullman? You get first dibs on Allan.
Going twice.
Yes, please stand and identify yourself and ask your question.
My name is Diane Kelly Riley. And I guess my question is, I work in an organization that is sort of committed to trying to change, or social change, that have awareness of these issues. But I guess more concretely, can you speak to how we can take steps to establish structures in our workplace that lead to more recognition and sort of practices that we might take up to change these sorts of situations?
I want to say no. I don't feel that I'm particularly well informed at the actual mechanics of changing organizations. There are people who really focus on that, and I don't. So I don't want to present myself as somehow being experienced and expert at this when I'm not, because I'm not. So of course that won't prevent me from responding to your question, will it? The only thing that, the first and only thing that comes to mind is that crucial to changing anything, whether it's an individual or an organization, is understanding what it is that needs to be changed. So if the focus is on gender, for example, how does patriarchy manifest itself in this organization? How is it concretely, how is it male-dominated? How do you see it? How do you see male identification, male-centeredness in this organization? How does the obsession with control play out in how we do what we do in this organization? So that then you have some sense of how does this thing that you want to change, how does it work? So if you want to change the mix of people who are represented at different levels of the organization, you first need to understand how did this mix of people get to be the way it is? And what keeps that in place? Because to me, that's how you know where to insert the lever, so you can start pressing down at the most effective point. You want to find that place to insert it. You're also going to have to educate a lot of people probably in this process, and you're going to need to be able to, they're going to need to understand what it is they're in. What are we doing here, and why are we doing it this way? What are the consequences of doing it this way? To then find ways of turning it into something else.
Good. Okay. Thank you for that question. I understand we have a caller live on the line from Olympia. Caller, could you please identify yourself and then ask your question?
Hi, yes. My name is Vagmai, and I wanted to ask about the theory to use my skills and create a group of people, of white people, who can start a grieving process for those who find it difficult to deal with the guilt around the issues of what our forefathers have done in the oppression of people of color. So we need to find a way to access that guilt that we feel that's probably been buried pretty deeply, and to bring that through so that we're not doing things out of a sense of guilt, but out of a sense of commitment. That's my question.
So I guess the question is, how do you deal with grief so that
Yes.
you can get beyond grief?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes. When you feel badly because of what has happened in the past and brought us up to where we are to now, there's a deep amount of grief that I personally feel. Yeah. And saying I'm sorry is
Doesn't quite cut it. Yeah.
not helpful. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. And so what I'm saying is, how would I be able to sort of gather myself in order to work on the grieving process?
Interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. I'm actually, the book that I'm writing right now, really, it's a novel, and it really is about grief and
Oh, okay.
our national grief that we do not allow ourselves to feel.
Yes.
Instead, we build monuments that have very little sense of grief in them.
Yes. Yes.
I guess I'll tell you what comes to, so I think grief is a very important thing in our lives, individually and collectively.
Yes.
And what comes to mind as I think about your question is, I was thinking about, well, if someone that you love died, how would you get access to your grief?
Yes. Yes.
And I think that in many ways it's the same thing. And for a lot of people, they don't get access to their grief.
Exactly.
Their coworkers expect them to be over it all in 2 weeks and so on. And so they have a couple of good cries, and then they say, okay, now I've had my 2 weeks, and now I'm going to move on.
Yes.
I tend to prefer those cultures where they will spend 2 months wailing and
Yes.
gnashing their teeth and tearing their hair out
Yes.
and screaming and really allowing themselves to feel the depth of what has been lost, because to me what grief is really about is loss, so that having been born into and raised in a society that includes in its history the legacy of slavery, the degree to which our society was built, our material prosperity was built not only on innovation and ingenuity and very hard work by white people, but also
Yes.
by genocide and just things that certainly parallel anything the Nazis managed to do in Germany.
Yes.
And for me as a white person who feels a real attachment to this country, I get tears in my eyes when I
Yes.
hear America the Beautiful.
Yes.
For me to come to terms with that brings up an enormous amount of grief. I cry. When I'm
Yes.
writing this novel, I cry a lot because I feel a tremendous loss. I feel that something has been taken away from me that I would
Yes.
like to have, and I'm not going to have.
Exactly.
So I guess my response to you is that would be that as far as I've been able to sort it out is to experience it in the way, to access it in the way you would access or experience any form of grief, which is to sit and really, just really sit with the enormity of the loss,
Yes.
to allow ourselves to feel in our bodies the enormity of the loss that continues.
And I believe giving myself the opportunity to do that, the person who sits across from me or next to me or walks beside me, I think that there's a sense of that, not the necessary need to admit or to say, gee, I'm sorry, it's been hard, for your particular ethnic group or whatever. I think something happens to me as a person, and since I've been in graduate school, I've noticed, since I'm in a gender and ethnicity class, the awareness that I have gained so far, when I look back at where I've come from, I have some moments of sadness, but also hope, because I realize that I know now what I didn't know then.
Caller, I have to interrupt you. We're going to run out of satellite time.
Okay.
I do appreciate your question,
Thank
though. You
you.
did bring up an interesting piece we hadn't touched on, and I think we both appreciate you taking the time to call in from Olympia.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I want to, looks like it's about all the time. We're going to get off satellite on time. I want to alert you all, both here in Pullman and in our satellite and video stream sites, to our next regularly scheduled program later this month. October 31, we'll be having a program, Extension Engaged. There'll be an update on our food safety programs with our special guest Val Hillers. So, it'll be on at 9 o'clock on October 31. And if you're interested in reading more about the topic we've discussed today, you can find both the Gender Knot and Privilege, Power, and Difference at your local bookstores, or you can order them from online from Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com. And if you'd like more information about Allan personally or about any of his work, you can learn more at his website. And we have the URL there on the screen with a screen capture of his website for you. And with that, I want to thank those of you here in Pullman for taking the time to come over and be with us in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on video stream and satellite across the state. And a special thanks to our guest, Allan Johnson, for taking the time during his visit to Pullman to do this broadcast with us. Allan, it's been terrific talking with you. I've enjoyed
it too. Thank you.
And I urge you all to plan to join us again on October 31 at 9 a.m. for our next Extension Engaged update on food safety programs. Until then, this is Scott Fedale wishing you a good day.